We didn't bring you here to talk, Martin Kessler snapped, his voice cracking across the glass-walled boardroom before the consultant had even finished his sentence. You're here to observe. Nothing more. A few executives laughed at once, relieved to know where the line had been drawn. At the far end of the walnut table, Kenji Sato slowly lowered his hand. He had only been pointing at a number on the screen, but Martin stood at the front of the room like a man protecting a kingdom built out of slides, and the interruption seemed to offend him more than the collapsing strategy behind him ever had. We are discussing board-level operating posture, Martin said, turning fully now. Try not to confuse attendance with authority. That earned him more laughter. Diane Rollins, his chief of staff, leaned back in her chair and smiled. Maybe he thought this was one of those inclusive workshops. Someone farther down the table murmured, "Should we form small groups?" That got another ripple. By the wall, a junior analyst named Elena kept her eyes on her laptop so no one would notice the anger rising in her face. Kenji had thanked her for setting up the room and asked her what she thought of the customer churn numbers. No senior executive at Valence Dynamics had ever asked what she thought of anything. Now she watched the room do what rooms like this always did. First they minimized, then they mocked. Then, once the safest person had been marked, they made cruelty feel procedural. Kenji only said, "Understood." He said it calmly. Too calmly. That unsettled Martin more than an argument would have. Inside, everything was expensive enough to suggest permanence. Imported chairs, smoked glass, custom water bottles, a giant screen full of blue trend lines and confident arrows. Martin turned back to the screen. As I was saying, our competitors are bluffing. Their pricing pressure is temporary. Their acquisition strategy is undisciplined. What this company needs right now is steadiness, not panic. He clicked to the next slide. It was another beautiful lie. Around the table sat the people paid to decide the future of Valence Dynamics. Board members who hadn't touched the product in years, operators who confused volume with wisdom, legal counsel already preparing to defend decisions she privately knew were stupid, and a chief operating officer whose silence carried the weight of inherited success. Near the head of the table sat an empty chair reserved for the CEO. Beside it was another with a closed folder, a turned-over name card, and a fountain pen aligned with almost ceremonial care. At the very end of the table sat Kenji in a charcoal suit that nearly disappeared into the leather chair. No flashy watch, no entourage, just a closed notebook, a silver pen, and the expression of a man who had learned long ago that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most dangerous. No one there except the CEO and CFO seemed to know who he really was. Outside this room, they knew. They called him different things depending on what he had done to them. The ghost, the surgeon, the last call. He was the strategist companies summoned only when denial had become too expensive. 3 boys had once sat in the back row of the same scholarship classroom, sons of immigrants who knew the cost of silence better than most adults. Daniel Vale had become CEO. Vivek Mehta had become CFO. Kenji Sato had become the man powerful people called when they needed the truth delivered without anesthesia. Daniel's flight from Frankfurt had been delayed. Vivek was in another wing with auditors, so Martin Kessler, interim master of the room, believed the stage belonged to him. Our enterprise accounts aren't leaving, Martin said, clicking to a slide marked Market Exposure. They're negotiating. There is a difference. Kenji's eyes moved from the headline to the footnotes, then to the lag date hidden at the bottom right, then to the appendix tabs Martin had no intention of opening. Elena noticed the shift in his face. It was tiny, a stillness. Martin kept going. We do not respond to noise by handing strategy to consultants who parachute in, manufacture urgency, and invoice for drama. Diane turned toward Kenji with fake politeness. No offense. None taken, he said. His voice was soft, not weak. Soft. The kind of voice that made wise people listen and foolish people make the worst decision of their day. Martin clicked again. The board needs confidence today, not disruption. The COO finally joined in. Exactly. We have operators in this company. We don't need mystics. Several heads nodded. Elena watched Kenji write a single line in his notebook. Then he closed it. Martin advanced again. Our biggest threat is internal overreaction. People are reading isolated losses as trend lines. Kenji lifted his eyes. They aren't isolated. A small silence opened in the room. Martin turned slowly. I'm sorry? They're patterned, Kenji said. Martin smiled, but now the smile had heat in it. You really don't understand what observe means, do you? Kenji said nothing. Martin stepped away from the screen and placed both hands on the table. Let me make this easy. You were brought here as a courtesy to Daniel and Vivek. That is the only reason you are in this room. You have not earned the right to interrupt me, and you certainly have not earned the right to reinterpret my numbers. Diane laughed under her breath. Unbelievable, one director muttered. Consultants always need to leave fingerprints. Another said, especially the quiet ones. Elena felt her pulse in her throat. She had seen this ritual too many times. The room first deciding who counted, then punishing anyone who forgot their place. Martin leaned closer. So here's what's going to happen. You will sit there, you will listen, and when actual leadership is finished, maybe we'll ask whether you noticed anything useful from the kiddie table. This time the laughter came full and ugly. Kenji did not flinch. He looked at the screen, then at the empty chair near the head of the table, then back to Martin. You should not finish this presentation, he said. The room went still. Martin blinked once. Excuse me? Because if you do, Kenji said, everyone in this room will be on record supporting a strategy your competitors already know you can't survive. No one laughed now. Martin stared at him. You've been here 15 minutes. That was enough. You don't know this business. Kenji folded his hands. I know what panic looks like when it has been formatted into confidence. Diane jumped in quickly. Martin, maybe we should just move on. But Martin had already made the fatal choice. Pride had him now. No, he said. Since our observer seems so eager, let's hear it. What exactly have you seen from your little seat at the end of the table? Kenji glanced once at Elena, Praf, then to the screen. The deck is using stale retention numbers from a quarter that no longer exists, he said. Your premium segment is being undercut from above and below at the same time. Your enterprise attrition isn't random. It is clustered. Your incentive structure is rewarding discounting over renewal. And someone in this room buried the worst indicators in the appendix because the truth would have interrupted a narrative. Martin laughed once, sharply. That's cute. Is that supposed to impress the board? It should concern them. This is speculation. It would be speculation if I were guessing. Martin lifted the clicker. You looked at a few footnotes and decided you understood the company. Kenji's expression did not change. No, I looked at a few footnotes and understood who didn't. Martin straightened. You mistake stillness for authority. You think because you speak quietly, people should pretend you're profound. This company was built by operators, not by men who sit around trying to sound dangerous. The insult lit up something older in Kenji. His eyes moved to the silver pen beside his notebook, and another room seemed to come alive behind his still face. A winter classroom. 3 scholarship boys in the back row, a teacher pausing too long over immigrant names, one rich kid whispering, they're only here because somebody wanted a brochure. His mother had pressed this same pen into his hand that morning and said, never let loud people teach you your size. He had kept the pen. He had outworked every one of them, and he had learned that humiliation was usually just incompetence wearing ceremony. Back in the boardroom, Martin was still talking. You consultants come in after the hard work is done and try to scare everyone into thinking complexity is a crisis. Some of us actually run things. Kenji looked up. Then run them honestly. The doors opened. Daniel Vale entered first in a travel-creased suit, Vivek Mehta half a step behind him. Neither looked at the screen. Neither acknowledged Martin. Both looked directly at Kenji. The room felt the change before it understood it. Daniel crossed the floor without greeting the board and stopped beside the far end of the table. Kenji, he said, and in that single word there was history, respect, and relief. Kenji rose. The 2 men shook hands like equals who had survived the same fire. Vivek let out a breath. I told them not to start. Martin said, Daniel, we were just... Daniel didn't turn. Why is he sitting there? It was not a loud question. That made it devastating. The room's attention shifted toward the empty chair beside the CEO's seat, the one with the unopened folder and the turned-over name card. Martin swallowed. We understood he was here to observe. Vivek gave a short laugh with no warmth in it. Observe? Daniel picked up the name card, turned it over, and placed it upright for the entire room to read. Kenji Sato, Special Strategic Advisor to the Office of the CEO and CFO Principal, Sato Advisory Group. A director whispered, "My God." Sato Advisory Group was not the kind of firm people hired for optics. Daniel finally looked at Martin. "Who told my guest, my advisor, and one of the finest strategic operators in North America to sit at the end of the table?" Martin tried to recover his voice. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No," Kenji said. "There hasn't." Daniel pulled out the chair beside him. "Please." Kenji moved from the far end of the table to the seat beside the CEO. It was the simplest movement in the room and the most destructive. People who had laughed minutes earlier began arranging their faces into professionalism, as if posture could erase memory. Martin looked at the screen as though it might still save him. We were reviewing a disciplined strategy based on current market conditions. Kenji sat, folded his hands, and said, "No, you were rehearsing a fantasy built on delayed data, false retention assumptions, and a competitor model that expired 6 months ago." He nodded to Elena. "Please open the appendix," Martin skipped. Her fingers moved before fear could interfere. The slide appeared. Buried in small text and muted bars were the numbers Martin had hidden: regional churn clusters, compressed renewal windows, staggered enterprise exits, declining margins disguised by short-term discount wins. Kenji stood and stepped toward the screen. "Here," he said, "this is where the fire starts." He pointed to a cluster of client losses. "These are not isolated departures. They are coordinated exits. Your competitors learned your incentive structure. They know your sales teams will protect quarter-end volume even if it poisons renewal. So they baited your people into discounting, waited for margin erosion, then built premium alternatives around your most fragile accounts." He pointed again. "This segment is leaving in groups. This one is signaling distress through shorter commitments. This one has already started migration." One board member said, "That can't be right." Vivek answered before Kenji could. "It is." What had been a presentation was now evidence. Diane leaned forward, desperate for a foothold. "Even if some of that is true, you're suggesting a major strategic pivot based on a snapshot." Kenji looked at her fully. "You're already committed to a course that ends in a liquidity event within 2 quarters. Continuing would be the pivot. Correction is just honesty arriving late." Martin tried one last defense. "We made decisions based on the information available." Kenji turned toward him. "You ignored the information available." Daniel faced the board. "Effective immediately. The current strategy is suspended." Silence. He turned to legal. "Draft the resolution." Then to HR. "Begin executive accountability review tied to this exposure." Martin stared at him. "You can't be serious." Daniel's face hardened. "I am. This is my division." "It was," Daniel said. The past tense ended him. Diane's voice came out thin. "Daniel, stop. You supported it. You defended it, and you laughed when correction was offered." The COO tried to speak about governance and process, but the board had already crossed the line where fear becomes self-preservation. Questions came quickly now. "How much exposure?" "Conservative estimate?" Kenji said. 800 million over 12 months if left untouched." "Who approved the incentive structure? Who buried the churn indicators? Why were the appendix slides hidden?" Every answer pointed back to Martin and the people who had protected him. Votes were called. Review procedures were opened. Access restrictions were discussed in language so calm it sounded almost merciful. Martin sat in the center of it all, watching his authority convert into documentation. At one point, he looked at Kenji and asked, very quietly, "You could have said something earlier." Kenji met his gaze. "I did." That was the end of it. No one needed security. Men like Martin were never dragged out. They were escorted by inevitability. The room emptied in deliberate silence. Elena packed her laptop last, hands steadier now. At the head of the table, Daniel and Vivek stood with Kenji for a brief moment that belonged to no corporation at all, just 3 men who had once learned in the same room what power sounds like when it underestimates you. "You staying?" Daniel asked. Kenji shook his head. "No?" Vivek almost smiled. "Of course not." Kenji picked up the silver pen, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and looked once across the boardroom at the chairs, the screen, the places where laughter had lived less than an hour before. Then he said, "Fix it." Clearly, he turned and walked out the way he had entered. Without performance, without victory speech, without needing anyone to announce what the room had finally learned. Some people mistake silence for weakness because they have never stood close enough to real authority to hear how quiet it is. And some rooms only understand the truth after they have laughed at it first. If Kenji's story moved you, don't just watch, act. Share this with someone who's been overlooked in rooms they quietly understand better than anyone else. Then do more. Respect the people who don't need to speak to see what's broken. The analyst no one asks. The engineer no one listens to. The quiet strategist sitting at the edge of the table. Support truth even when it interrupts comfort. Listen before collapse forces you to. Invest in clarity, not ego. Comment below with moments you saw someone dismissed and were proven right. Subscribe to Beyond the Model Minority for more stories of invisible authority, the ones who don't demand power, but carry it anyway. Because the next Kenji Sato is already in the room, already watching, already understanding, and when everything starts to fail, it won't be the loudest voice that saves it. It will be the one who saw it coming. Invisible authority, quiet power. See the truth.